Gales Creek Watershed Association webinar. We're so excited today to have Rick Huffman from Earth Design join us to share about designing with nature, celebrating Earth Month in your yard. This is going to be a great way for us to wrap up a really lovely weathered Earth Month. And so I'd like to go ahead and ask that everyone mute themselves and note that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be available afterwards. I know some people have requested that. And if you have any technical issues during this, please just put those in the chat just to respect everyone, and I'll help you address those privately. And if you have any questions that arise during Rick's talk, if you can also put those in the chat, then at the end, I will ask those to him and we can get all of your questions answered at the end of the session. So without further ado, because I know Rick has a lot of really good, exciting information, I'm going to turn it over to Madeline Fletcher, who's our board treasurer and education committee chair, who will introduce Rick.
Thank you, Carmody. And I am not going to spend too long on this for sure, because I want to get over to Rick and hear what he has to say. But I'm just so excited to have you here, Rick, because, well, to all of you, if you've read the blurb, you'll know that his present position among many is that he is the founder and the principal of Earth Design, which is a landscape and environmental design firm. But he's so much more. He's had 35 years of experience in the area of environmental and land design, with a strong ethic of a strong theme of land ethics and education. I first met him back in the time when he'd founded the South Carolina Native Plant Society. So he's been involved in this such a long time. And I'm just so glad he's here to share with us some aspects of his long experience and passion and knowledge for the topic that we're focused on today. So thank you for being here, Rick. And I'm looking forward to the next 45 minutes, hour, whatever, with you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can I share screen now?
Yes, you should be able
All right, should be ready to go.
Okay.
And you will probably, if you haven't already, you want to switch your view to speaker view so that you get a better look at his slides.
Okay. Can everybody see okay?
No, that did not work. Hold on. You know, I'm sorry. When I shared, it took the controls back to just the host. I apologize. You should be good now.
Okay. Did that come up?
Nope.
Don't forget to click share.
Well, y'all, we practiced this yesterday and it worked just fine.
I got it. It's a user error as usual. Okay, there we go. Everybody see it? Okay, there we go. Does everyone see the screen? Okay, great, great. Okay, so Madeline, Carmen, and Trish, thank you all for having me today. It's a great honor to be here speaking to the Greater Columbia Garden Club today. Just love the Columbia area and spent a lot of time down there viewing the natural resources in that area of the state as well. And so we're just excited to be here today and share a little bit of how we think and how we approach about landscape ecology in the 21st century. And so what that entails is, just like the title says, is understanding our human connections to our planet, understanding that biodiversity, native plants, and applied ecological services is the heart of what we think about when we think about sustainability and sustainable landscapes. And so I'm going to share a few things with you today that I think you'll find some interesting, and maybe some things you haven't heard before, and just a different approach to the way we think about landscape ecology. So I always like to start with reflections and connections. And so I've always been big into land ethics and philosophy. And so in college, I was introduced to the San County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. And I like to start off with his quote: "All ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of the community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundary of the community to include soils, water, plants, and animals are collected with land." And the Aldo Leopold book is a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I suggest that everyone have a chance to read that book. And Leo Wilson is a modern day philosopher, biologist, world-class ecologist. And he says, does man have the capacity to save life on the planet? And that's a great question. And then to follow up with Chief Seattle, which I've read all his letters to our president back in the 1800s. He said, man did not weave the web of life, he was merely a strand in it. And whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. So when we think about landscape ecology, it matters. So to know where you're at in landscape perspective, when I first started the Native Plant Society, someone asked me, says, well, how do you know it's native? And so what is native and what isn't native? And so we've kind of, as Europeans came in, we kind of added a lot of things that weren't native, and we kind of shook the bottle up. And so we have a mixed bag of things today. So to know where we've been, where we are, you have to know where we've been. And so we want to take a brief look at what we call the ancient systems and gain that historical perspective to know, one, just what is native and maybe what isn't native, but also to have a glimpse back into what our landscape looked like. And so we're fortunate in South Carolina, and that in the 1700s, we were the botanical center of the universe. And so every botanist from world-class botanist wanted to be here and wanted to be studying the flora and fauna of the Carolinas. And so we're going to talk today about Mark Catesby. We're going to talk about William Bartram, Andre Michaud, Thomas Walters, and De Soto. And so, first, we just talk a little bit about De Soto. De Soto came to the Carolinas in the 1500s. So he was the first one to make a travel through the Carolinas. And even though he wasn't documenting plants per se, he did write about the character of the landscape. And so he wrote that horsemen could ride 4 abreast through open grasslands and trees, and that the Native Americans had burning extensively. And so it wasn't the oak hickory or dense forest that we thought that the Europeans would encounter. There's a lot of open grasslands and prairie-like, or savannas and prairie-like conditions. Thomas Walters, the picture down the lower left, Thomas Walters was from Somerville, and he published the very first botanical manuscript in North America. And so good claim to fame there with Thomas Walters. And Thomas Walters had the confidence of Carl Linnaeus, who was the person who came up with the binomial system for naming plants. And so again, botany is very much deeply rooted in South Carolina. So when so we take a look at these maps, and these are the map of the Cherokee Nation. And so I love these old maps. These old maps just tell us so much. And I just can't get enough of them. And I think I've had about 5 maps in here, and I cut them back. But these maps, you can see where the Mississippi River is, and you can see all the water, where the rivers are, and you can see where the mountain ranges are, and you can see the scope and the breadth of the Cherokee Nation. But if you look at a newer map than that, you can see the map of the Carolinas as things began to evolve. And you can see where the map of Camden, you can see the map of Beaufort. And so how all these townships were laid out. And so it was just a wonderful glimpse at these maps and seeing how South Carolina began to evolve and to shape out. So from that perspective, let's look at Mark Catesby, naturalist. And if you look at the date here, and you can see that he predated Carl Linnaeus, who was the person who was responsible for the system of naming plants scientifically. So Mark Catesby was just a wonderful illustrator and a terrific observer of nature. And so he arrived in Virginia in 1712, visiting his sister. And when he landed, his sister didn't see him for 3 years. He took off to the woods and he didn't show back up for a couple of years. And so they didn't know what happened to him. But he explored the James River, and then he returned back to England and did a presentation to the Royal Society. And they were so impressed with what his illustrations, and you can see the illustrations on the left, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But they sent him back to the Carolinas. And so he arrived in Charleston in 1722, and he spent 3 years exploring the Carolinas, Florida, and the Bahamas. And so, his illustrations, you can see on the left, each one of those was anatomically correct. So he captured the fruit, he captured the flower, he captured the animal that was mostly closely associated with those plants. And so in his records today, the best collection of his records today are at Furman University in the library there. And so I've had a extensive look at Catesby's career, and his wonderful book that he put publication was The Natural History of the Carolinas and Bahamas. And you can see that on the right. And then you can see the wonderful illustrations of a blue heron that he drew there, and just the wonderful amount of detail. And a lot of these were field sketches. It wasn't like he come back and did a wonderful painting. These were all, a lot of these were field sketches that in turn were just simply art in a botanical way. So again, these beautiful images, again, you notice how he captures the fruit, the flower, and the seed. So, and also the wildlife, more times than not, associated with that particular plant. So we have these wonderful look back to his work. And again, you can see the plant on the left, and you can see how he depicted that plant on the right with his paintings. And if you look at this, the detail, it's just simply incredible. I encourage you all to look at Martin Catesby a little closer. So John Bartram was a naturalist, and he was considered the first American-born naturalist. And he was noted for his botanical and ornithological drawings. And so his father was a botanist and pharmacologist. And so they worked for, who funded their expeditions were pharmacologists, people looking for medicinal plants. So, William Bartram, he wasn't very successful in anything except for looking at plants and drawing. And I had a fine opportunity to visit his plantation up in Philadelphia several years ago. And I was so impressed and felt like I'd been there before. But in 1773, he made a 4-year journey exploring 8 South Carolina, South and Southern colonies. And he arrived in Charleston. And in 1773 and 1774, he did the Johns River, and he began to explore the Cherokee Nations up in the Kiowa. And his book, The Travels of William Bartram, if you ever have a thought about knowing what our landscape looked like 250 years ago, look no further than The Travels of William Bartram. And if you look at the time that he was here in the 1770s, you think about what was going on in our nation. You had Native Americans, you had a lot of conflict there, you had the Revolutionary War beginning. So there was a lot of things going on during that period of time. And for a man to be traveling mostly by himself, collecting and documenting plants and encountering Native Americans, etc., he was a really brave individual. And so here's a print of his travel, his manuscript that he published. It took him about after he came back from Carolina, it took him about 15 years, I think, to actually get this up and published. But it's a great read, and I've read it over several times, and I find it just always fascinating. So you can see some of his illustrations that he himself drew. And again, you look at how these images were captured, you can see the wildlife, you can see the plants, and how everything is connected. So we're going to talk about biodiversity today. If you look at that illustration right there, that is the essence of biodiversity. And so that's what they were looking at and what they were observing. One of the plants that made Bartram kind of famous was the Franklinia tree that was founded somewhere near Savannah. And we still have plants that he took back to Philadelphia, but we have not been able to find that plant in the wild again. And so this is the Franklinia tree. And so again, great illustrations. But as he described the scenery about where he was at and what he was seeing and what he was encountering, one of my good friends, Philip Juris, took those writings and he went back to these areas and drew paintings of what these areas, what Bartram was describing. And so this is Anthony Shoals, where the Rocky Shoals spider lily is. And you folks in Columbia know deeply that, you know, the Rocky Shoals spider lily was heavily in the confluence in Columbia. And and I've had some opportunity to work with those plants in the confluence of Columbia area. But he also, here's an illustration where he described the Seneca River, Oconee County. And there's places where we can go today in Oconee County and it looks just like this. And so again, this glimpse back in time helps us with our perspective of knowing really kind of where we are in the landscape ecology. So Andre Michaud is another famous botanist, and so that came through our area, and Andre Michaud was always born into farming, grew up and excelled at growing plants. When his wife died, he just locked himself in and just really dedicated his whole life to studying botany. And so he had some good tutorship there at the Palace of Versailles. When he came to America, you know, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson really recommended him very highly. When he came to Charleston in 1786, he established a 111 acre botanical garden. And, you know, and a lot of when these explorers or botanists came to Charleston in South Carolina, they really didn't want to leave. They loved it so much, they really wanted to make their permanent home there. But Andre retraced Bartram's route of the Savannah River up to the headwaters, and where he made lots of discoveries, magnolia, rhododendron, and of course his claim to fame is Shorty glacifolia, which I'll talk about in just a second. And so he just made his way up through the rivers and system of Savannah, and he was being one of the true botanists that we admire and have his records to look back on. So we kind of know what was what. So here's a capture of the Black Mountains up in North Carolina. Here's a copy of his manuscript that he published, Borrelia of Americana. And so a good Frenchman, I guess. And so here's some of his illustrations. Again, all these folks were just wonderful illustrators. And that's one of the things that captures me so much, just their ability to draw and capture these images. And so Andre Michaud is famous for finding the Oconee bell up here in the upstate, up in the Jocassee Gorges. When he wrote a description of it, people thought it was in North Carolina, and they looked for it for over 150 years. They couldn't re-find it until they started to put the dam in at Jocassee Gorges, and they rediscovered this plant. So the plant Shorty glacifolia was found by a man who never named it, which is Andre Michaud. And Asa Gray, the picture of the guy here, it was a father of American botany, Asa Gray, who looked for it for his whole career and couldn't find it. And then it was named for a man who never saw it. So interesting paradigm about the Oconee bell. So what a wonderful plant. So to just shift gears a little bit. So now we've got that historical perspective. I want to talk about living earth ecology and why it matters that we capture our landscape ecology and restore a little bit about our heritage. So we asked the question, are we doing sustainability for our children's future? And we have to ask ourselves these ethical questions. Why should we care about the environment? What are the most important? Are we the most important beings on the planet, or we just want to Earth millions of different forms of life? And do we have the ethical obligation to pass on to future generations the extraordinary natural world and conditions at least as good as we found it? My good friend Rudy Menke, that's always been his philosophy, and it's always been mine as well, to leave this place a little bit better than we found it, at least do no harm. And so that's one of the approaches that we like to take. So again, go back to Aldo Leopold here, and you say Rick loves Aldo Leopold, and I do love Aldo Leopold. So I can't get enough of it. So, But just understanding things through his perspective and understanding that, again, our purpose and what we're trying to do with sustainable landscape ecology is work for our children in that ecology. And so, which leads us to understanding biodiversity and what is biodiversity. I teach a lot of classes in this type of stuff. And so when you mention the word biodiversity, you ask people, what is biodiversity? Could you see it? Could you point to it? Do you know it when you see it? Can you smell it? Can you touch it? What is it? And so this graphic illustration really puts a graphic perspective to it's all living things, and none of it is not used. Everything has a role, and it's all about these life connections. And so what we try to do is put these connections together. And so when you understand the biodiversity, you understand about native plants and native ecosystems, you understand the ecosystem services that they provide for us, from sunlight to food, producing oxygen, mitigate weather effects. Insects are the stealth drivers of all of our ecology, really. And it's about food chains, it's about disease control, it's about agriculture and all the things, living things that we encounter in our life. And so if you look at this photo to the right, I like to think of it as communities, plants in communities, and it's all an assemblage of natural communities. And so when we think about how we do landscapes, we think about that as our philosophy. And so would you know biodiversity if you saw it? You know, I showed this slide and it seems just like that most people walk through a forest, they don't see things. They walk so fast or we drive so fast, we don't really take the time to look and slow down or slow down to look. So you walk by a log like this, but you might not notice anything. But there's a whole city, a biodiversity world out there. There's mosses are flowering, you know, so there's just a whole lot of things going on there that are biodiversity. And so I get so excited talking about this part of the program. So connecting the plants to the animals and the insects, as I mentioned, insects are the stealth drivers. But you can just see these beautiful plants and these beautiful connections. So you see the insect world that again, sometimes we don't see these things and we don't notice these things, but they're part of that natural world. And so embracing this, we tell a lot of folks, we landscape for the little guys. We design and build for the things you can't see, which are these guys. And so if you want biodiversity and you want to accept your role to support wildlife and have beauty in your landscape, understand the ecology and the biodiversity that these guys bring. So these are just some beautiful pictures of these connections. And so it's all about making these connections and having that touch and understanding that each plant and each insect or each bird all have a role. And again, in nature, nothing is wasted and nothing is futile, including our fungi. And so we've been using fungi at Earth Design for 25 years plus, and we use fungi to help solve environmental problems as well as make our landscapes really productive. And so again, just these beautiful pictures showing these beautiful connections of mosses and lichens and plants. I think all of these things are just part of understanding who we are and the beauty that all around us in our native plant world. And whether you're from the mountains or you're from the Midlands or you're from the coast, there's nowhere you can go in this state where you can't see the natural and beautiful plants and the wonders that they bring. And here's another great photo of a Oconee bell, Shortia glacifolia. And I'll spend a couple seconds talking about that plant as we already introduced it. You know, the term glacifolia means it was left over from the glacial period. So this is a glacial plant that got trapped here in the interglacial period. And then when the glaciers receded, it's still here with us. And so all across our state, we see evidence of these remnants of time that was, again, ancient. But it's all about an interactive process. And so this interactive process is, again, through our landscape design and our philosophy and our business, this is what we try to do. So we start with understanding what these habitats are and how we can use these habitats to actually provide restoration and what we call biomimicry. So biomimicry is at the heart of what we try to get across in all of our landscape designs. So from granite outcrops on the top left to the cool mountain waterfalls there on the right, to the high mountain meadows up here at Table Rock Visitor Center, which we did 20 years ago, and to the pine flatwoods that you'll find in the Midlands and the Low Country. So all these wonderful things are tools basically that we look at, and how can we use these tools to apply in landscape. And so for me, flat rock, granite outcrop communities, which we have abundant here in the upstate, and I guess these outcrops do travel throughout Augusta, over into Georgia. So these are really globally rare ecosystems, but they're locally pretty abundant. And here you get a glimpse of a flat rock community, and you can see the little elk porpine flower on the left, and you can see it in the peak photo to the right. And so this is in the city limits of Liberty, and not many people know that it's there. But again, so how we're going to talk about how we apply these things like this. If you have a hot, dry parking lot, and you have a roof, then that mimics the conditions that this plant likes to live in, or this ecosystem likes to live in. So what we've done, we've taken this plant community and we've applied it to parking lots and rooftops. And so you hear green roofs. Well, what is a roof? It's basically a granite outcrop wannabe. And so that's how we try to apply these things. So so we look from granite outcrop to these spring ephemerals. It's been a really great spring. I'm out every weekend looking at plants and chasing them down. And so here you can see the wonderful mayapple that I just took that picture last week, the wild geranium, and of course the wonderful, beautiful trillium simile that I just took that photo again last week. So I just love all this spring wildflower chase. But again, the point is that they provide the models for good landscape ecology and design. And so again, this is another inspiring photo of the rocky soil spider lily. Again, this plant is in the confluence area of Columbia. It's in the Catawba River, and now we found a new population over on Stevens Creek in McCormick County. And the Native Plant Society has acquired that site and has it protected forever. But again, we look at these models of these low country tidal systems as well, and we work all across the state. And so we look at these systems, and it's about that system. We love the individual plant, but again, it's about the system that helps create the habitat for these things to occur. And again, Francis Marion is another great place that we've been using fire as an ecology of a tool. Basically, the Native Americans burned a lot. And that's something that maybe a lot of people in South Carolina miss, is that most of our landscapes in South Carolina were fire maintained natural landscapes, were fire maintained landscapes. And so in the Sandhills, for example, is a good example of fire maintained landscapes. And then you have Francis Marion here, and then the Cypress Gum communities and the Blackwater River systems. And so in these low country systems, we find Calopogon tuberosa, or we find the hooded pitcher plant, or the Spiranthes, which is lady tresses. And so again, all these things point to how wonderful we are as a state botanically, but also they inspire us to create landscapes that capture the essence of this in our projects. And again, and I just love Carolina buckthorn is also a Midlands to low country eggplant. And then the coral bean there, which is another great plant that I love finding in the low country. So at Earth Design, taking all this thing that where we've been, where we're going, looking at the inspirations that we have all around us, understanding these connections, both from a microbial level all the way up to oak hickory forest or forest regeneration, it creates a design philosophy. And so when I got involved with Gooseberry Building Council many years ago, I served on their board for 5 years, and still continue to do a lot of work in what we call the sustainability arena. Everything we think about is how is it going to be sustainable. And so the word sustainability goes around a lot, and you hear it now more and more. but what does it really mean? And what does it really mean in the landscape? So when it comes to thinking about sustainability in the landscape, you can read our philosophy here. When we think about sustainability in the landscape, it has to be socially equitable. In other words, it has to fit in with the neighbors, and it has to be environmentally sound. So we want to protect soil and water and support wildlife. And then lastly, it has to be economically feasible. And where those things come together, that's what we term sustainability. And so that's in a nutshell kind of how we view it. And so being in the landscape architecture field, ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architecture, has come up with an alternative or a companion with LEED and sustainable buildings. And it's called SITES, S-I-T-E-S, SITES. And it provides a framework for identifying and implementing practical and measurable, and again, the words practical and measurable, sustainable landscape design and construction, operation, maintenance, and solutions. So again, taking that holistic approach to it, to any site that we work on, allows us, and armed with that history and that inspiration, we feel pretty good about what we're trying to get done. So, so what are our tools that we try to apply here? How do you do this? And we call it applied ecology. And we have these green tools. And so what we try to do is use landscapes like a salve or a wound to heal things or make things better. And again, make those connections to the things we've already shown you. So what we want to do is water efficient landscapes, green roofs, water collection, creative bioswales, riparian buffers, ecological habitat, and education. On the riparian buffer side, I had the honor of co-authoring a book called Life at the Water's Edge, which is all about riparian buffers and the science of why we need more riparian buffers. And as a state, and locally as well, we need to always understand what the role of riparian buffers are in protecting our water quality. And when you think about sustainability, in that we define sustainability as how we work with water. If you look at in your landscape, water is the resource that landscapes have the most influence over besides soils, and those things go hand in hand. So if you look at some of our tools here, they're all geared mostly toward water, and how we can protect and restore water quality in our landscapes. And so the photo on the right is Upstate Forever's office, and this is in a downtown lawyer community there. So this is kind of, guess you could consider this a residential project, but again, this was LEED Platinum, and that one of the first LEED Platinum projects in the state of South Carolina. So saying it's all about the water, it is all about the water. But when we talk about the individual landscape, this landscape versus that landscape, that's great, but we need to think about it as a watershed. And when you start to think about watershed thinking, think like a watershed. And so a natural watershed is a balanced, sustainable ecosystem. Evapotranspiration is part of that. You look at this slide here, you can see the depressional storage, and you see the infiltration there, and how this watershed actually works. So this cross section can be lifted up and applied anywhere in our state, and they all work basically the same way. And but we need to always have a watershed thinking approach to our work. And so, and particularly as we begin to grow and become more urbanized, the urban stormwater hydrology, and what we've been trying to do is make the case for low impact development. And I've been working with Upstate Forever and others all across the state for a good 20 plus years on getting this type of thinking, watershed thinking, into our everyday practices in our cities and our urban areas. And so it's just a different way of thinking. Landscape can be a green filter, or it can be a gray funnel. And so, of course, we think that it should be a green filter. And that green filter is your sponge, and it's your filtration system. And just like we mentioned the riparian zones, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But again, this is the kind of thinking we want to have. And so more and more municipalities are heading this direction. I'm glad to see that. And so I think this is coming into our focus, into our communities, and we all should embrace it and understand what its role is. So the role of landscaping is really can be a buffer to heal, to clean that water before it goes into the groundwater. So one of our goals is always, how can we take stormwater, which is most people, how can we get it underground quick, efficiently, and how can we clean that water in the process? So here's a couple of examples of some residential rain gardens that we did. You see one on the left is more of a bog garden. It's a bog situation, and and the one on the right is a true rain garden, and one is a little more sunny and one's a little more shady. But you can see the concept and how they can work on a small footprint on any scale. And so whether it's a large project or a small project, this applications are still pretty much the same. And then we've been doing this for a long time. So, and when we think about stormwater, we think about it as art. We think there's no separation in good design. It's good design. But we take that, go back to valuing water. You know, we need to understand most times on construction sites or stuff, the goal is to get the water off the site quickly as possible. And no matter what, we think right the opposite. We want to get that water, we want to capture that water, and we want to keep that water, get that water underground where it can clean the water and also recharge our groundwater. And so I think about it as watershed design. Watershed design equals sustainable communities. And so through stormwater wetlands, groundwater recharge, and phyto and micro remediation, we think stormwater and art are the same thing. So here you can see an example of the YMCA in Greenville, where they had a mud puddle right here, and we took that mud puddle and we made art with it, and we captured that stormwater and we got it into a nice rain garden. And so now you got a place for people to gather, and when we dealt with the stormwater through an artistic design here, and it just worked out really, really wonderful. So another tool in our tool belt was the riparian buffers, and this is a community that we did up in Greer, South Carolina, where it was the drinking water for the city of Greer, Lake Robinson. And so the developer had clear cut everything down to the nub, was pouring tons of fertilizer on everything, and it was going into the drinking water. And so he got us out there, and I started immediately talking about riparian buffers and what the importance of that was, and how you should stop using fertilizer because it's a toxin. And so I said, well, you need a riparian buffer here. And he said, well, how much is it going to cost me? I said, well, it's going to cost you nothing. I said, here, just let it grow up for about 3 or 4 weeks and see what you got. So after about 3 or 4 weeks, the slide on the left, you see what he got after about 3 or 4 weeks. And he called me up. He said, the whole thing just lit up. It's just beautiful. And he said, well, I don't know what this stuff is. And so I went over and we walked it again. And he said, I just love this. He said, this is great. And so you see the meadow on the right, we did that as well for him. And then we did that one. And but you can see a little bit of management, a little bit of installation can go a long way. And so, but when it comes to these riparian buffers and understanding these things, we think education is the biggest thing. And so our book, Life at the Water's Edge, that we wrote, it was a National Resource Publication of the Year in 2005. And then my work with the Friends of the Reedy River on their board. This is one of the parks that we just completed a couple of years ago, where the riparian buffer has been established if we can keep the city from mowing it down. And but education is key to understanding. So here you can see another project where we've done a riparian buffer along the Reedy River. And here you can see we're using volunteers to grow it back to health. And so this was just full of invasives. We took the invasives out and we began to grow this thing back. And again, this will serve not only as a beautiful asset and a benefit for wildlife, etc., but it's just a good resource for the community. And so when we look at riparian buffers, or we look at any of our landscapes, and we talk about, how do we remember our tools there, we had phyto and micro remediation. So, and we understand this connection through grasses. So we've been looking at how we can remove toxins from our soil and our water. And our biggest tool that we have, from a plant perspective, is grasses. And so when you look at this slide right here, look at the depth of those roots of those native grasses. And again, so they're holding everything together, and these things actually isolate the contaminants and render those contaminants harmless. And so I'll show you a few examples of that. So here are what we call the heavy lifters. And these are plants that remove toxins from the soil and water. And so here you have little blue stem on the left, and you see the photo on the right, where you've taken it out of a meadow context, and you've taken that same plant and you put it into a landscape design. And but make no mistake about it, that plant's going to soak up 10 times its weight in toxins. And then what it's going to remove is nutrients, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, solvents, and leachates. And that's a lot of what we have to deal with when we're talking about water quality. And so again, the same group, another group of plants here, purple lovegrass, and here you can see the Spartanburg Water Department we did, and that was like 18 years ago. And I took this picture last year. 18 years, this landscape still looks like that. And as you can see how we use these plants, and they can look well designed. Good design is good design. And so it's how you manage to use these plants in a constructive way. And so we're really proud of this landscape. It was great. And these grasses do a lot of heavy work. So again, the deep-rooted grasses, this was a site that was so eroded, the house was ready to slide into the lake. And you know, they had engineers over there, they had everybody talking about how they were going to save that house. But we came in with native grasses, and we stopped it. And so the native grasses with those deep roots, guess what? They held that whole thing together. And they also provided water quality. So again, another application of how we use these native grasses and these ecosystems that we've been talking about. Here we've used prairie meadows with native grasses to solve leachate problems from treated effluent from the city sewer treatment plants, REWA. So again, these grasses are sucking up those things from those big spray fields for the treated sewage water. And the same firm that we've been working for, REWA, the sewer authority, here's where they went solar and they're going green. But what to do around these solar panels? So what we put in around these solar panels is prairie ecosystems. We put a Piedmont prairie there. And so what better example of how to use a native application, a native plant community in a setting where they can work with a sustainable product like solar panels. It looks great and they love it. And here's some corporate landscapes as well we worked on. This is an upland prairie where we installed or designed and installed for Clemson University ICAR campus. And this has been great because you see all the plants that are in there, the butterfly weed that support the pollinators. Again, everything we think about is how we're going to support wildlife. And so here's another example of Michelin, wet meadow and Piedmont prairies. And so again, the little blue stem we showed you earlier, here, in hot, tough, dry conditions. I mean, these plants thrive in it without very little or no irrigation. And then the slide on the left is how we take wet loving grasses and sedges and rushes and put them into wet ponds. So instead of having a detention pond, we do wet meadows and get out of the detention pond thing and put these systems in, and they work and function a lot better to clean the water. And again, getting the water on the ground and cleaning it into the process. So we work on a lot of different scales, a lot of different types of projects, and each one is a different type of setting. This is the Pickens County Museum. And so what we wanted to do is capture, Pickens County has some of the highest species count of native plants anywhere in the world. And so we have 1,400 species of plants in Pickens County. And the Valdivia rainforest in South America only has about 800 or 850. So we live in a high biodiversity place right here. We wanted to capture the essence of Pickens County in this landscape. And so again, putting native plants, native plant communities in public landscapes where they can be educational and make people real proud of where they live at. Well, we also do this and apply this on residential scales as well. So here you can see a meadow in the middle there. This is Harriet Burke, great client of ours, and that turned out really wonderful. And you can see the model on the left where you have the beautiful coreopsis and the blue curls. And then you can see a photo on the right where we took an erosional situation and we solved it and healed it with native plants. And so working towards a residential scale, so looking at things on a residential scale, we can see that good design is good design. We work 80% of Earth Design's work, 70–80% of our work is still residential. And we have never tried to move away from residential because every backyard matters. Every backyard matters. When you have 11 million acres in North America, that is backyards. I mean, every backyard matters. Connecting habitat connections, stormwater, all of it, thinking like a watershed, every landscape matters. And just throw out a little statistic. When we think about our current landscape practices in our country, we use about 9 billion gallons a day of water in America for landscapes, and 80% of that is for lawns. If you do the math, that's 3,285 billion gallons of water a year goes in landscapes, and 80% of that is in lawns. We try to think about, you can have your lawn, but let's just try to make it a little smaller and it's a little more water efficient. So this is good design right here. This is my good friend Frank Holloman. And so you can see this was, I didn't have a before picture, but he had runoff coming right up against his home. So you can see a little bit of a rain garden there, and it's hard to know that it's a rain garden, but it certainly is a rain garden. And then you can see the slide to the right where we created woodland biodiversity there. And here you can see how that began to evolve after 2 to 3 years, where we had, again, the term biodiversity. You can see that diverse landscape. That's great. But again, taking advantage of working with our clients, to understand their drainage patterns, their landscape, their ecology, their plant communities that they have, and how we can again take plant communities and make it work for us. So here you see the wonderful Monarda running through the middle of that. Well, that's where the drainage goes. All the water goes to a drainage system right there. So we put that into that drainage area, knowing the water would be great in there, and it would create this, what we call the ring of fire there. And so just a lot of biodiversity within that project right there, and taking advantage of what the landscape has given us. And then taking our roof water from the roof of the house and putting it into bog gardens and rain gardens. And so on the right, you can see the bog garden, and that bog garden has got some age to it. It's performing very well. And so you see the blue eye grass in there. You see the pitcher plants. There's a whole host of ferns in there that come on a little bit later. And a lot of these landscapes, they don't look the same month after month. They keep changing and keep evolving, just like nature does. And so again, another residential project where we use plant communities. So this was a residential project where we used ground covers. They didn't want any lawn. So again, how to use ground covers like green and gold here. This plant lives all over the state. It's a great ground cover, easy to find in their trade, and it is tough as nails. And it's a stick plant. You can beat it with a stick, you can't kill it. And but just a wonderful look at how you can use native plants in a landscape that can stand the test of time. This project was done in 1998, and it still looks like this right here. So, but on a little more formal level, we do a lot of formal landscapes, landscape design. Here you can see the one on the left with a nice patio and wine room that we helped design and create for the home residents here, the walls, et cetera, that we put in. But it really, again, you sum it up and you look at, again, the beautiful flowers that are seasonal, that change over time. And then the image on the right, you can see a more formal Italian Renaissance home. Again, we wanted to capture that essence of Italian Renaissance design, but we wanted to use native plants in there to supplement, or we use all native plants, but it's an Italian Renaissance design. And so these plants can fit into just about any landscape and do well. Again, good design is good design. So, and again, so this is another great example, a little bit of formality, but also if you look at that photo there, you can see native azaleas, you can see the serviceberry on the upper left in the background. That's one of our great native understory trees. You can see the Oconee hydrangea, and then of course you can see the boxwoods and the formal patio. So through good design, you can create landscapes that again serve all of the trophic level of wildlife, the ecology of storm of water, etc., but also look very good and stand the test of time with less maintenance. And you know, we haven't advocated or used a bag of chemical-based fertilizer since we've been in business. And so we tell people fertilizer is toxic. So all these landscapes you see, no chemicals, no fertilizer, and reduced water needs. And you can do that through combination of fungi and other things that we use in our trade. So to kind of wrap up here, you know, we asked ourselves, go back to the original premise that we started with. Why native plants? Native plants, birds, and pollinators have co-evolved like that biodiversity that we went through for millions of years. And so, and native plants provide what we call ecosystem services for us. They provide food, shelter, and host and nesting for our wildlife, but they also provide things for us as well. And so you can't separate out the pollinators and the role that native plants serve for that. Again, feeds us all. And native plants require less fertilizer and chemicals, like I've said. And then of course, we wanted to bring nature home to every landscape. And so it's with great pleasure when our clients call us, or somebody calls us and say, you know, I'm sitting here and I'm just enjoying these birds here, and you gave us a list of plants and birds, and we're just sitting here and we're just enjoying your list because and the birds that are coming to our home. And so again, we want to bring nature home. And then native plants create a sense of place. So when you see sometimes what we call traditional landscape with a lot of plants that are from some other country, you really could be anywhere. You could be in California, you could be in Michigan, you could be maybe anywhere. But when you use plants that are from our state and our native ecosystem, we create a sense of place, of who we are and where we are. It's our native plants that define us as people and our history, just like we saw at the beginning of the program. So again, they create that sense of place, who we are. And then lastly, as we talked about Leopold there, we create those land values where we place a higher value on natural things and natural places so that we can protect those places and preserve those places and restore those places so that they can be there for our future and our children's future, just like we talked about earlier. So again, with all of our things that we do, it's about education. And how can we bring this education from school groups to adults through the Native Plant Society and other work that I've done. In 2003, I was blessed to receive the Environmental Educator of the Year Award in 2003 and the Governor's Award in 2006, for my work in promoting this type of thinking and this type of concept. But all that being said, there's nothing like being able to see the wonder in the eyes of these children as they encounter these landscapes and they learn about how these things are connected. More importantly than ever, we have to reach out and create a value system. When we talk about land ethics and we talk about the value system, it starts with the children. And so I spent a lifelong mission of mine to dedicate myself to teaching and teaching children about the role of natural landscaping and natural ecology. And that's all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one is, how would you control undesirable plant growth like weeds?
Well, the first thing everybody wants to think about is, they want to grab their bottle of Roundup and they want to run out there and start spraying things. And so, fortunately, unfortunately, there are times when, I'm not a big proponent of herbicides for any reach there, but sometimes they are in some certain situations with certain plants, they're going to have to be used in some manner, shape, or form. And I think if you use them, follow the label and use them correctly and do your homework and get the right ones, you can be pretty benign about it. But what we use mostly to rid ourselves of invasive like English ivy and those type of things is just mechanically pull them up, physically pull them up. And we've been very successful at removing English ivy just by pulling it up. And it might take 2 years, one year to knock it back and the next year to get the rest of it out. But we found that works really pretty well. And then what we call targeted herbicidal approach, where we use a cloth glove and we just are on top of a rubber glove, and that way we can handle directly what we want without having to spray things. And so there's lots of ways of doing this, but I think mechanically, like you saw that Reedy River slide we showed you, that was just full of invasives. Well, all those were, we hired a contractor to come in and they basically pulled them out and then let it grow back and then pull the rest of them out. And that worked really, really well. But that's always an ongoing thing, is how to keep the undesirables out. But that also means you need to know what's native and what's desirable and what's not desirable. And there's some great plant lists on the Native Plant Society website about what our native plants are and where you can go find them.
That's great. That was actually the next question that came in, where to find a list and if you have a favorite list of plants or grasses.
Yeah, in the Native Plant Society, if you go to the homeowners section of the South Carolina Native Plant Society, there's a plant list there that I put together, and I tried to keep it simple. Plants that you could find. I didn't put any plants there that you couldn't go out and buy or find, but it's broken down by sun or shade, wet or dry, and so that's a great list of plants there. And it also gives you the wildlife value of what wildlife that plant will serve, either in nesting or nectar or foods or seed source. And so that's a great one there as well. If you go into our website again, if you go to the Low Country chapter, they put together some nice extensive list about low country plants there as well. And you folks that are in the Columbia, they're kind of in between. So you get to use a little bit of both the upstate plants and also the low country plants. So there's some great lists on the Native Plant Society website. And there's also a National Native Plant Conservation Alliance, and they have a regional plant list as well. And but I really think that the list that we have on our Native Plant Society website are as good as any as I've seen in a concise way. And so they break it down pretty. And again, knowing where to put these things goes back to understanding the communities, plant communities that they live in. Everybody's yard is a plant community, want to be. Nobody gets out of that. Just like all of us live in a watershed, we all have plant communities in our landscape. And so if you have a subdivision where things have been taken back to zero and it's brand new, then you're going to start with plants that are on the early successional stage that can take it hot and dry and sunny. Or if you've got a woodland situation, you're going to be looking at plants that take it more on the other end and they require shade and maybe moisture. So those lists that we provided there break it down as such, and so that's a good place to go. And if I can, there's a book called Landscaping with Native Plants of the South by Andy and Sally Wasowski. And their book, they've got a new edition come out, but it's been a really go-to Bible book for a lot of us in the design community, because it not only tells you the native plants and what communities they live in, but it also tells you the companion plants that go with those plants. So that way you're able to not just put a individual plant out, but you're able to put a community of plants out. And that way your landscape looks more natural and it functions better when you put a community, a plant community in rather than sometimes individuals. And again, you don't need the whole of the community. You just want the essence of it that fits your aesthetic desires.
That's excellent. Very helpful. Do you have a suggestion for where to get grasses such as the little blue stem?
Yes, there's a mail order place called North Creek Nursery, and North Creek Nursery is out of Pennsylvania, and they have a mail order where you can buy plugs, and they excellent plants, and their whole website is wonderful. You can buy a lot of native plants there. They all focus just about solely on natives. There's another mail order called New Moon Nursery, and New Moon Nursery is very good as well. But for grasses specifically, Baker Environmental is a great source for the native grasses, and I know the owner of that company very well, and I probably wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for his company selling me plants back in the early 90s. So those are some good plant sources. The Native Plant Society, we have plant sales as well. So keep an eye out for those plant sales. And they have Low Country in the upstate has one in the spring and fall. And we're working on getting our Midland chapter up to speed so that they can start to have their own plant sales at Midland. So there are plants out there. And, you know, a lot of places like Home Depot and these box stores, they have native plants. They just don't know they're native. And and not none knows anyone else. So you just have to do your little homework, understand what you're going for and what you're looking for. And the plants are out there. And again, the Native Plant Side is a great resource.
Wonderful. And Gales Creek Watershed Association, also on our website, we have a handout that identifies invasive species and native species that are good alternatives for those. And we also highlight some of the local nurseries where you can find some natives. And also related to that, we have a comment, your work is beautiful and inspiring. How can we change the garden industry to change its thinking and change their widespread marketing message? Native plants are getting wider known, but the box stores are still selling the same old non-natives. Great.
Well, that's a great question. And this is what I've been working on my whole career, how to change the system that's broken. And I tell folks all the time that the landscape industry is broken, and it's been broken for a long time. It's all about marketing. It's all about the aesthetics that we have made people, driven people towards, you know, what we think is aesthetically pleasing. So we have to get one understanding what we think is aesthetically pleasing, get people out of that concept. I think changing what we call changing the paradigm, and that paradigm shift and how we change the way we do business when we're thinking about our landscape. As I mentioned, it's the biggest consumer of water, and it's the biggest polluter of our water. When phosphorus and nitrogen hit our water, they do great damage. So nutrient pollution is huge. And then of course we've got herbicides. So all those counts, what we need to do is become better informed consumers. It's about supply and demand. When I started Earth Design in 1996, nobody knew what a native plant was. They had no concept of what a native landscape should look like or what it should entail. So we had to really do a lot of education there, both on the aesthetics and applications of these plants. So we're still on that paradigm shift. And so embracing the SITES initiative with the American Society of Landscape Architecture, embracing that, because as I look at that, what they put together with that, it's really the roadmap to how we change the paradigm. And so again, since 1996, 95, look at how far we came. Now native plants are a household word, you know, and more people demand for native plants. The natives plant society in up in the upstate. We just finished our plant sale. We sold $30,000 of plants in 2 weeks in a COVID world. And so the demand is there. It's supply and demand. And if you look to the wholesale nurseries, there's an abundance of native plants out there. But if you look at the retail market, they're not. And so we have to, again, get that supply and demand in there. So go to your local garden center, et cetera, and ask them to take care of native plants. Provide them a list and say, we'd like to see you carry these plants. And so it's supply and demand. And as well as education. And that's what I've been doing, is trying to provide the education platform to change the paradigm.
As someone who would really like to plant more native species in their yard, but is a little overwhelmed, what advice do you have for how to get started with yard design or plant selection?
Great question. I think that book, as I mentioned, the Wasowski book, Landscaping with Native Plants of the South, that book is a great roadmap. It has design illustrations in it, showing how you work with design and have companion plants, etc. The book is well laid out, and about what the plants require and what they need, and it also helps you with understanding what plant communities those plants come from. And so that's the best way I can. It's a good resource for that book. There's also Wildflowers of South Carolina book by Dr. Doug Rayner and Dr. Richard Forshey. And that book is broken down by plant communities. It's a good ID book for the field, but it's also good to understanding, okay, this is the conditions that I have. Okay, I've got these conditions, and here's a whole book of plants, and I don't want them all. I just want the ones that, I just want the ones I can acquire. So that's helpful as well. And another thing that we've been doing, we have a certificate program, a native plant certificate program, which is through the Clemson Botanical Garden. And that is a certificate class, a series of classes where you'll learn the grasses, you'll learn the herbs, you'll learn the trees, and then you'll learn the pollinators, you'll learn, sustainable gardening practices, etc. And then my class is a part of that core curriculum is designing sustainably, and it covers a lot of things more in depth than what you got today. So that's a great resource to sign up and take those classes. And whether you care about getting a certificate or not, these classes are highly informative, and they'll help you understand your landscape conditions a lot better.
Those are great resources. Thank you. Can you say something about pavement, pervious and impervious, and the value of pervious?
Yes. So as you saw in our slides, we talked about stormwater. Our goal is to get the water underground. Somebody asked me and said, well, what's all this about sustainability? And I said, it's just getting the water underground. It's not rocket science. Get the water underground. So pervious pavement is a ability to get the water underground. So, but there are things to be wary about. So say if you did porous pavers, pervious pavers. So those things they can clog up on you. So you have to kind of keep them blown off or vacuum basically, because they'll clog up. I know we put some up at Furman University under some solar panels and stuff. Well, their instructions was they had to blow it off or vacuum it twice a year. Well, they didn't do that. And so guess what? It clogged up. It didn't work. So they went in with it. They had to go back and clean it back up. But now they got with the program and it's making it work. But we certainly want to get more pervious systems in. And then where you do have impervious systems, have some way of capturing that runoff into a situation and again, to get the water underground. So a lot of times at the end of a curb or gutter, like we showed you some of those pictures, we want to allow the water to get to a low point or an area where we can, again, capture that water and it slowly sinks into the ground. And but the pervious, we certainly like pervious concrete and asphalt. The technology is getting better, but again, we're still, it just has to be maintained. And as long as you understand that, then you're good to go. But so that's just a little bit of word wise on those systems.
And I'm muted. Okay. Thanks, Rick. It looks like that's all our questions. So I just want to say thank you so much again for your time and enlightening all of us today. I really love too how you brought home how every backyard matters, because I think everybody is always wondering what little things that we can do ourselves as individuals to make a positive difference. So I just love that you were able to share that with us and give us a lot of great resources to make that difference at our own home. So thank you so much again for your time, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. We really love hosting these webinars, and so please be on the lookout for the next one in May. And we do have a good opportunity for people to get outside. We have a cleanup coming up in the Gills Creek watershed on May 15th, and you can sign up on the homepage of our website. But if you have any other questions for me or Gills Creek in general, or Rick, our information is on the slide, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that you all have. So thank you again, Rick, so much. And thank you everyone for attending. And yes, we will be posting this recorded version on the website, and I'll be sending it out as well.
Great. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Okay. All right.